Hi, I'm happy to see you again in the Risk Blueprint. Today, we'll talk about a classic in risk management, risk and control assessment. 3 topics as usual: the principle of risk and control assessment, the different methods and steps during workshops and after workshops, and finally, case studies and examples. So, one of the oldest tools in the toolbox of operational risk management is the so-called RCSA, for risk and control self-assessment. The practice has evolved from the self-assessment by the business themselves to the RCA, the risk and control assessment. But in a nutshell, we are talking about workshop-style discussions leading to the evaluation of first the inherent risk of the firms. So these are the risks technically before the application of any controls. And when this is a bit unrealistic to you or to some departments, and that would be typically the case of IT departments or legal departments, we're looking at inherent risk in a sense of the likelihood and an impact of a risk in case of a multiple failure of key controls. And so the next step is obviously the C part of the assessment of the key controls in place and their effectiveness, leading to the residual risks, which is the residual exposure to potential event that you're left with after the application of your control environment. So what can you expect? What should you be able to expect from an RCSA or an RCA? Well, first of all, it is not only an assessment exercise, but it's very much an identification exercise. So it is a discussion about the type of risks, 2 objectives that the firm is facing. You obviously lead to the residual assessment in stress conditions. So we're talking about the risk when you're pessimistic yet realistic, but you're not talking about day-to-day volatility here. The important element of the process, obviously, is the assessment of the control effectiveness. And that's where the market practice has evolved from the self-assessment, where the business themselves evaluate their control, to some sort of objective assessment through control testing. And finally, the evaluation or the confrontation of the residual assessment to risk appetite and tolerance of the firm, leading to further mitigation action plan if the risks are deemed excessive, or to a continuous monitoring if the risks are at a level that is tolerated in the organization. Consistency is a must in your risk management framework, and the RCSA and the heat map, so this probability impact matrix color-coded that you see, really inserts very well in a risk management framework. So in this visual, you see pretty much all the elements of a risk framework fitting together, from the overall risk appetite statement of the firm, translated into types of risks and risk per risk appetite statement that is matched by or aligned with the risk taxonomy that we covered in the previous videos. The tolerated and calibrated impact, high, medium, low, extreme, that is matched with the impact taxonomy that we also covered. And then you have the axis in likelihood and impacts that translates what's high, medium, low, both in frequency and severity, and also the colors, the red, amber, green, or a red, amber, yellow, and green that align to risk appetite, which we also covered in a video. So these heat map and the use of this heat map in an RCSA process is really driven by the rest of your framework. So what are the typical likelihood scales that you can find in the market? 4-point scale, 5-point scale. It largely depends, but here, let's take the example of a 5-point scale from almost certain. That almost certain think of a 1-year horizon likelihood. We're looking at events that are more likely than not. So anywhere between 50% likelihood and let's say 80% likelihood at a 1-year horizon. After that, I wouldn't encourage you to run a risk assessment for that. It's not a risk, it's more an expected loss. And then you go down the likelihood scale from 1 to 3 year horizon. So you're looking at roughly a 30% likelihood of occurrence at 1 year horizon, down to possible, unlikely, 5-10% chance. And then when you are less than, let's say, 5% occurrence, you are more in the tail risk, the 1 in 20 years, 1 in 40 years. And this is the space of scenarios. And I'll detail more using visuals for that. The impact scales, if you followed me on previous videos, you have seen that, or if you have my book, you have seen that as well. So you have the scales that align to the impact types that the firms wants to focus on in terms of avoidance or regulatory, reputation, continuity of service, often, not always, but often, especially now with the regulation on resilience and critical business services, and obviously financial impact, with a calibration of what constitutes low, moderate, up to extreme. Just a word of caution, because I see some deviations or some poor practices in firms. Make sure that the severity of your different impacts align also in terms of financial significance. So, for instance, if you have an event that is deemed extreme, representing 25% or more of your yearly operating income, for instance, and let's say that is 10 million euros, have a check that what you define as extreme in service delivery, customer reputation, and regulatory is a wording definition that corresponds roughly to these 10 million in my example, or this order of magnitudes in terms of financial loss, so you don't have imbalances on that. I just want to attract your attention on this. Now, what are the typical methods and steps that we use at Chapelle, BDO Chapelle, and BDO Belgium running these assessments? You have activities in workshop, which is more the part of control, risk and control self-assessment, where the participants are highlighting what are the risks to their objectives, what is their view of the risk assessment, what we call perceived risk rating, so perceived risk after the controls, and the list of controls identification. Then post-workshop, you have quite a lot of work, or consultants or risk managers have quite a lot of work in performing and validating the existence and the assessments of the controls through documentation, so it's not too dissimilar to an audit examination techniques, and control evaluations, existence, results of control testing compared to incidents, etc. And then once the risk assessment, the controls are examined and the residual risk assessment is validated, then you have a potential additional risk treatment, so i.e. additional action plan if the residual risk evaluators are above risk appetite. And so visually, what do you expect at the end of a workshop? So we're in the self-assessment phase before you do this examination exercise. Well, you want to come out of an RCSA workshop with a list of what are the key concerns, so what are the key risks to this segment, this department of the organization. Another word of caution, make sure that the scope of your RCSA workshop are wide enough and homogeneous enough. So you don't want to have just one workshop for the whole bank or the whole organization. You don't want 200 workshops for 1,000 people organization. You want to segment basically 10, 12 for a mid-size company would be good, where you have a scope either per department or thematic per risks. So what are the key concerns? What are the descriptions of the risks? what are the control descriptions for each of these risks, or addressing each of these risks, important in terms of governance, who are the control owners. And after discussions and consensus, that leads to a risk ratings. And so you have a first visual in the example here of the position of these risks. And in my example here, pure illustrative examples, you have 10 key risks that are positioned on the risk appetite matrix. And you see that at first analysis, all the dots that are in the amber and red zones are risks that are deemed above risk appetite, and the others are within. Now, after the control assessment, there will be a reconfirmation of these assessment, these evaluations of the risk. And those who are indeed above risk appetite, when positioned on the matrix, would need to have an action plan and an action plan owner attached to them. What's the purpose of the exercise? What's the main benefit? The main benefit is to prioritize risk management. Now, for those of you who are with me since the beginning of these videos, you remember that my first criteria for effective, mature risk management is proportionality. Proportionality means big risk, big focus, small risk, small fuss. So you want to concentrate your risk appetite, your risk management to what matters, and make sure that you don't have the so-called fatal flaws in the organization. So you don't have fatal flaws in your excessive exposure or in weak control, so that your risk, you have some risk in this quadrant when both the likelihood and the impact is high. You want these red quadrants to be empty, and you want to decrease your risk as much as possible on the left-hand side of the graph into these mundane small risk, even if they're likely that sort of the operating cost of doing business, and then limit as much as possible this risk amber rectangle when you have a low likelihood for a high impact risk. So it's really a resource allocation exercise more than anything else. And so just to finish more on a, I wouldn't say advanced, because, but let's say good practice, and a bit of a different practice is to represent the RCSA matrix in a way it should be, in a sense where the width of the lines and of the columns are proportionate to the type of impacts. And if you think of the probabilities, you know that the risk on the green zone here, the cost of doing business, is almost 100% likelihood. So these are bands of very likely events that are wide when the scenario is really a thin line. So it helps to represent your matrix where the impacts and the likelihood are in width and size roughly proportionate to the number they represent. And the other element that you can see in this graph is that for a given risk, let's say information security, it can materialize in very different instances. It can be as simple and as common as a loss of a device. And when you have organizations of thousands of employees having each a laptop and a phone, you can pretty much expect that every year you're going to have a number of devices that are lost. The impact is quite minor if the controls like remote erasing and general encryption is well thought through. And then you have the less frequent exercise, less loss of critical data with some sort of contingency planning up to the point of cyber attack. So my point is, use these RCSA workshop to link it to real business discussions on what happens, what's tolerated, and what needs to be further taken care of. And then finally, just a point of technical aggregation, because it's a question I have a lot of the time in terms of reporting risks. A simple way to aggregate several risks on a matrix is to sum the different risk per quadrant of the matrix. We've done that at BDO Chapelle and BDO for years when we run RCSA program, and it's a very easy way and very intelligible way to report your risk. If you want to know more, there will be downloadable guidance available on our website, and it's also fully explained in the best practice book. For more information and more concrete examples on RCAs, check out the case studies on our website.